We've already went through TMF and SDA. Gen Insight, the final product of the Unspoken Premise, will answer most of the overlooked parts of my Unspoken Premise video, as well as a clearer view of the Gen system. As this will reflect a larger picture, I've listed categories for you to track. First, we got the PMB system, introduced in my Unspoken Premise as this triangular radio chart. Because the little screen time wasn't enough to fully describe its role, I'll bring this back up. PMV stands for Progress, Model, and Visual. Serves as a subgrading system of the Gen. Its purpose is to grade aspects of videos in the industry. Each vertex defines a specific aspect of the video. Progress is the adaptation ratio of the video. It can be 1:1, 2:1, or even 3:1, but it would be too overkill. The ratio can also be a non-integer number, like 0.7 or 1.4. Model indicates the quality of materials shown, not just their appearance, but also how they were executed. This scale can reflect which Gen 1 selected and their own progress along the path. If the model is low, then it could be because of one of these issues. Lack of consistency between shots. Rely too much on borrowed resources. Minimal details. And prioritize on progress or visual. As opposed to if the model is high, it will reflect that the video is either highly developed and consistent across all contexts, not relying solely on their Gen, and capable of deploying unique features. To put it bluntly, a bad model is rough and recycled, while a good model is refined and polished. The industry is averaging at meso-modelization, recognizable design with workable consistency. This often can't be elevated due to the pace of production. Visual determines how much of the story is converted to the screen. A typical video will sit somewhere at 50%, just enough to express intentions. The rate can be pushed higher, but drawbacks are inevitable, and one surely can't manage it at such a pace. In sum of everything, we got a 3-vertex structure of video grading. Progress decides how dense or loose the video feels. Model shows how well the material is designed. Visual measures how much of the story survives the leap from text to screen. Together, they form the PMV system. Stretching one too much, and at least one will follow. The core purpose of this system is to judge whether a video is merely a fleeting instant or something that carries long-lasting value. Second, we will re-examine the logic of the Gen formation. In the Unspoken Premise, I said that a Gen forms from an enhance with a resource circulation. You may doubt why there is no new circulation to form a new Gen on top of the current 3. Creativity is limitless, but why is there nothing new? The reason there's nothing new is that I have a more comprehensive vision for the industry than just listing Gen, as well as utilizing the existing stable to build my concept upon. Regarding the vision, we'll discuss it in the last category. Back to the point. Since circulations can't be formed into a Gen naturally, what are the conditions to be so? And does it always have to be enhanced, not plus or pioneer? The conditions will depend on the properties of the circulation. If it's only a few characters being circulated, then it'll still be considered as enhanced, and the expanded elements are for driving progression of the industry. Unexpectedly, a substantial proportion will also not guarantee that it will develop into a Gen. For what cause? Doesn't matter if the circular proportion is great or small, unless it can withstand the friction of time. One's resources will hardly reach upwards of a Gen. If you're still confused, we'll visualize it. Here's a line chart of the presence and time, divided into 2 zones. Green represents outer influence, and red represents inner decline. Every influential burst will tend to decline afterward. If the influence drops into the red, It will indicate that the influence is collapsing from within, and even the owner is abandoning it. A typical circulation doesn't gain enough longevity to establish values in the industry, and will often die out over time. The proportion only acts as a safety net for the influence. The chance of inner collapse will increase for those with a small proportion, and vice versa. A gen can hold itself despite how vast time may stretch, all thanks to its great size and stability. You could ask about the absurd demand for a gen, judging from where it takes place. In reality, a gen is often the embodiment of multiple circulations combined. Its concrete examples are Gen 1 and 2, as the main pillars of the entire industry. Their inner collapse zone is near zero because the industry's growth is directly linked to their influence. That's all for the conditions. Let's move to the second question about the reason for not using Plus and Pioneer for circulation. It comes down to one thing. Enhanced is the most prominent and reliable option. Beyond PMV, individuals are also evaluated by mutation, which refers to the degree of alternation compared to the overall industry, and persistence, which measures the capacity to sustain from collapsing into inactivity or abandonment. The magnitude degrades progressively from left to right. When I describe enhanced as prominent and reliable, I mean that it stays balanced in every scale, delivering the stability a gen usually requires. I understand that this naturally raises a further question of what assumptions am I starting from? And it's this that will explore the nature of these advancements in greater depth. For Plus, I've defined it as a noticeable advancement of a gen over time. More precisely, Plus represents a permanent advancement, superseding the existing state as a gen transitions into its next phase. Consequently, when I refer to something as Plus, I'm implying a form of dependency within what I call the gen's orbital. Nevertheless, existence of the former state won't migrate to Plus. Instead, they will still be active in the industry as prior. For enhanced, its fundamentals should already be evident. Individualized, untethered from time, and inherently singular. It may exist in relative independence from a gen base, with that relationship denoted by the arrow. Alternatively, it can remain a dependency within the orbital, yet retain sufficient distinction to assert its presence. For Pioneer, the structure mirrors that of Enhanced, but with a markedly higher degree of independence and far superior traits. In fact, some Pioneers barely resemble products of the industry at all, unless the individual manually identifies them as such. The arrow may still be drawn, but no matter how exaggerated its scale, the orbital lacks a capacity to absorb Pioneer into itself, an indication of just how far this advancement has been pushed. I maintain a fairly flexible threshold for what qualifies as Pioneer. Anyone who tries bold concepts and elevates themselves above others may be regarded as such. Freshness, after all, isn't an absolute requirement. Does this loosen the sense of foremost? No, because pioneers inevitably bear the cost of defying the industry itself. With this closer examination, several conclusions emerge. Pioneer, while exceptional in ambition, lacks the simplicity and accessibility necessary for dissemination and circulation. Plus, by contrast, is fundamentally dependent. Its reliance on the gen tends to suppress originality, leading to a slump of ideas that trigger mutation. This leaves Enhanced as the remaining choice. Positioned within the gen's optimal zone, either along the orbital horizon or just beyond it. It's this equilibrium that ultimately substantiates a claim that proves Enhanced stands as the most prominent and reliable option. After the re-examination, the logic of gen formation becomes clear in both its strengths and its limits. It defines how stability and endurance give rise to a gen, yet it doesn't authorize indiscriminate ranking or premature inclusion. When evaluation ignores context and variation, classification risks collapsing into oversimplification. This limitation leads to the third category, one that concerns judgment rather than structure. Do I respect diversity? While concluding about Gen 2 in my unspoken premise, I have mentioned this. There are a lot of forms of character out there, yet they share the same commonality of being humanized. All of this is wrapped in Gen 2. Also, an individual will be listed as Gen 2 if their resources, although being high quality, didn't have enough influence to evolve. Interpreted through what we have just established, Gen 2 represents the ideal of humanization. For context, the industry is essentially rooted in panda characters, originating from the panda head emoji. In order to reach a wider audience and expand thematic scope, these characters were humanized, giving rise to the second lineage. Furthermore, the Gen 2 designation isn't limited to dependencies alone. It also extends to enhance, including those with uncertain circulation, and pioneers of any form, all which collectively embody the underlying ideal of Gen 2. And, of course, this arrangement is also applied to Gen 1 and 3. Within the distance to the core of a gen lies two inversely proportional measuring units. Mutation, the unit that intensifies as one moves further from the core of a gen. Persistence, the unit that enlarges as one moves closer to the core of a gen. These are the values I introduced a moment ago, whose origin is from these graphs in Unspoken Premise that approximate the behavioral fluctuation of the three advancements. They can be used to measure the gen structure. Such architecture, born from contribution, possesses not only stability and size, but also both a high mutation and persistence level. But if mutation and persistence are inversely proportional at the individual level, why does a gen score high on both? The answer is scale. For one individual, high mutation means high deviation, which leads to the risk of instability. Conversely, high persistence means routine stabilization, which suppresses deviation. No individualistic workflow in the industry is capable of handling both. It's either be dynamic or stay static. However, a typical gen isn't powered by one individual. It consists of both individuals and circulations. Some push mutation, others reinforce persistence. The inverse relationship may still exist locally, but universally it cancels out, because gen, in definition, is a distributed vector of resource transmission formed by accumulated circulations around a shared tendency. Hence, a gen doesn't directly possess mutation and persistence. These values originate from the countless individuals and circulations. They accumulate through aggregation, which bloats up the overall density of mutation and persistence displayed as properties of the gen. Aggregation is also a factor that shapes the stability and abundance of a gen, arising only from the structural mass of the circulations. This will shed light on how multiple circulations contribute to the longevity of such a region. Multiple circulations can reduce the risk of collapse by simply existing within it and committing to the flow of transmission. This ensures that the system will rarely run out of resources, and thus has a lower likelihood of disintegration. From the volume, naturally comes a stability in time. Because the flow doesn't rely on a single participant, it remains resilient even as circulations enter and leave. When it's recognized that all properties come from individuals and circulations, where exactly are they based? The structural gravity, which is the underpinning area illustrated as this orb right here, doesn't include these properties. It holds no resources, no mutation, no persistence. All material exists within the orbital. The core only defines the orientation of the resource gradient in the region, with it becoming progressively sparser toward the horizon. And when knowing that resources are unevenly distributed across the orbital, individuals positioned differently within it will not behave the same way. Bridging this back with the 5 earlier assumptions, we'll be aware that they're actually the structural consequences of the system as a whole. For mutation and persistence, they're acknowledged because of the rigid structural role in the system. In the sparse or empty region, one will be provided with little to no reinforcement. Therefore, higher reliance on self, mutation, and sometimes the arrow must be established due to the alternation. Contrariwise, in the denser region, one will receive more reinforcement, thus higher persistence and stationarity. What about the structural consequences of the PMV? At a glance, it's constructed like a singularity of rank, which then introduces hierarchy by collapsing into a single absolute peak, leaving everything else beneath it. To resolve this misconception, let's discover its abstract definition. This hierarchy, by definition, represents the predictable allocation patterns under a finite individual capacity for the majority of individuals within the respective advancement. Specifically, this is an emergent tendency conditioned by individuals' structural position. For a deeper conception, you can read it here. Remember, this tendency is merely applicable to a fixed extent of the advancements. Some dependencies can fit more effort into their working window. Some enhanced can still be rendered insecure despite the balance. Some pioneers can earn their position without any intensification. The gen doesn't assign value to individuals. Instead, it distributes conditions. Mutation, persistence, and PMV don't define worth, only behavior and outcome under constraint. Diversity, in this structure, is not the absence of classification. It's the coexistence of different structural conditions and the behaviors they produce. No position within the gen guarantees superiority. Each reflects a different balance between support, risk, and capacity allocation. Everything I've said so far assumes gen is a cluster of circulations, utilizes quantity to achieve stability, is non-involved, and is a vector of transmission. This structure depends on one condition, which is transmission distribution. But what if that condition is broken? There exists a case where circulation is the gen itself, where transmission doesn't distribute, and where stability can't rely on quantity. This anomaly is Gen 3. So, how does such a structure behave? The transmission and its flow are still current, though the orbital is deficient in circulation for raising reinforcement, and therefore more prone to collapse. This is what I refer to as Gen 3. As the observations from the recent suggest, the core of this gen has matter. How will this affect the entire system compared to an archetypal gen? According to previous categories, circulations retain a role of enriching the orbital through the process of aggregation. Except Gen 3 functions in a monarchy, where the individual symbolizing the gen solitarily nurtures the amelioration of the orbital. This accounts for the drawbacks this lineage must face. With the power focused on a single point, quantity expands haltingly, and parallel contributions from accumulation become impractical. The system itself must achieve every growth milestone manually. Such an arrangement forms a distribution chain, leaving no redundancy. If the chain stagnates, everything is disrupted, leading to an eventual departure of participants. Without the accumulation and parallel processing ability, aggregation can't happen. This is critical because missing it means a gen must fall back to the individual level. The same limitation we observed before returns, or when referred to a gen, is the constant oscillation of presence and absence. Considering the evidence of significant shortcomings, is there sufficient basis to affirm the existence of Gen 3? If a gen requires distribution, why does a non-distributed gen still form? The basis for this is that other attributes can continue to support its existence, notwithstanding the identified shortcomings. In the category gen formation logic, I stated that a gen can sustain itself over time through its size and stability. Despite not fulfilling any of these, Gen 3 still exhibits traits that distinguish it as an exclusive offspring within the gen system. Unlike a circulation, this generation can still create derivatives that catalyze advancements, regardless of the demerit in quantity. By the same token, the vector doesn't disappear as long as that handoff continues, ungovernable by oneself. Fundamentally, Gen 3 doesn't sustain itself through structure, but the continuity of effort. Yet you must ask what purpose such existence truly serves. Its aspiration, mutual with the two predecessors, is to provide the baseline conditions that make model construction more straightforward within one's PMV. The baseline conditions here mean a gen doesn't directly interfere with the vicissitude of model. Hence, while gen can play a role in uplifting the scale, true flourishing requires an individual to introduce deviation, sustain consistency, and at the causal level, to sacrifice capacity elsewhere, often progress or visual. Overlook those adjustments, and model can't thrive. Gen supplement is just a peripheral support. Because capacity allocation operates under uncertainty, low investment in one dimension doesn't guarantee higher investment in others. Synthesizing. Gen 3 exists as a gen below the threshold that the definition describes in full. It qualifies as a gen from a circulation because it sustains direction and triggers derivation. It contradicts the definition only if circulation is mistaken as a prerequisite rather than a condition for stability. So, mistaken in which way? The earlier supplemental description of resource circulation, or the first half of the category gen formation logic, has been fabricated to transform the assertive individual to gen statement of my unspoken premise into a more progressive reinterpretation. I admit the mistake that I had built the foundation of the Gen 2 refutable and Gen 3 specific. And so there comes a gap for multi-perspectivality throughout the categories. Gen 3 here isn't a definite anomaly nor a new definition, but something more inclined as an emergent gen. A gen that serves more as a subdevelopmental transmission vector of Gen 1 or 2, driving people who bond with a stimulating yet delicate region by validating their personal creativity. After establishing the reformulation of the gen framework, a challenge remains. Is this theory a lens we impose on the industry, or something the industry itself produces? The second to last category, path forced, argues the latter. To reiterate for both newcomers and the involved, based on my study, it can be described as this. Silly animation, or this in its original text, is an informal, yet platform-visible micro-industry operating primarily through personal channels, where solo creators adapt novels or scenarios into short-form 3 to 6-minute animated videos at a sustained pace of approximately 2 days per upload. The industry's material backbone is vector graphics, which is a rational production decision for viability rather than an aesthetic choice. Vector assets are scalable, reusable, and accumulate into private libraries over time, making such an aggressive upload cadence economically viable for operators. This seems to be structurally central to the industry's character, enabling everything from resource sharing between creators to the industry's defining upload rhythm. The rhythm of one video every 2 days isn't a creative decision, but a conditioned behavioral norm, shaped by platform algorithmic logic that rewards consistency and punishes stagnation. Creators who slow down lose visibility, lose audience momentum, and consequently lose income. The cadence is therefore understood as platform-imposed piecework rather than as a chosen production schedule, and the silly animation label functions as the cultural management of its consequences, a self-deprecating paratext that preemptively frames aesthetic limitation as identity rather than failure. Critically, this isn't hobby production. Some actual people depend on this for their livelihood, which transforms every creative decision into an economic calculation. Quality, experimentation, and pacing are all negotiated against the hard constraint of sustainable income. This economic reality gives the industry its peculiar tension. Creators are simultaneously artists, adapters, and micro-entrepreneurs, conducting alone without institutional support, collective bargaining, or shared infrastructure beyond what the platform itself provides. The industry has no unified identity. There's no studio, no collective brand, no governing body. Yet exhibits remarkably consistent norms in visual style, production logic, content purpose, and even self-designation. This coherence without coordination is one of the industry's most theoretically striking features. Shared conventions have emerged and remain unchanged not through enforcement, but through the quiet pressure of a shared environment. Same platform, same source material culture, same material constraints, same economic stakes. By the time a creator has been active in this environment long enough to understand it, the resource logic, or the industry's nonverbal rule, as I usually use to mention about it, has already shaped their production habits. The platform rhythm has already modified their output behavior. The audience's atmospheric expectations have already calibrated their adaptive instincts, and the observable patterns of those who came before have already narrowed the apparent space of viable approaches. These observations aren't coincidental patterns. They're the predictable output of an environment whose pressures are specific enough, consistent enough, and inescapable enough to produce recognizable orientations in the people they act upon, regardless of those people's individual intentions. From these observations is what the Gen framework describes. The industry, left to its own pressure, converges. The weight of fundamental solitude, audience expectation, and economic necessity, sustained long enough, leaves individuals with a narrowing set of orientations they can realistically inhabit. Gen 1 holds a primordial reference point of this convergence. It's a ground that formed before anyone thought a name for these animations, shaped by how individuals collectively treated an industry that had no institution to define it for them. It's the origin that the industry keeps returning to, the initial character design that makes this space recognizable as itself. Gen 2 answers what Gen 1 alone can't sustain. Audiences that already know the source material, who came carrying their own atmospheric expectations, or even outsiders who just knew about the story through the animation, can't be held indefinitely by a foundation that was never built for such narration. The non-human factor must become approachable and better felt by the vast. And Gen 3 emerges from an individual who has refined their subjectivity to stand out enough for rampant spread, accompanied by sustained derivative production, to form a structural force that pulls others toward them personally. By essence, others follow tendencies not out of dependency, but because that refinement lowers the cost of their own. And in an industry where even a slight model uplift can widen the margin between surviving the cadence and being consumed by it, that pull is anything but incidental. Situating from the path of inevitability, this framework simply names what was already there. There's a hidden fact that's also worth bringing up. Time moves in one direction here. It always has. The creator who entered this industry carrying nothing but a source and a deadline didn't choose the ground they stood on. the aesthetic they inherited, the audience waiting to verify what they already knew, or the economic current pulling them forward before they had finished deciding their goal. The industry received them the way it receives everyone, quietly embraced them without pre-signs. What compiles along that axis was never entirely theirs, but they carried it anyway. They're still carrying it now. And the path, changeless, remains exactly one direction long. With the name path, the described environment it produces, the formalization of the structure it generates, and the map direction it leaves available, where do all these go? The industry, as it stands, absorbs its own pressure. Creators enter, inherit the advantage of the orbital, negotiate the cadence along with other pressures, and move forward along the time axis. The framework expresses this as a structural truth that's so by design. However, within that same framework, a counter is possible to reorient things internally. If the not yet spoken vision I said in Gen formation logic is still stuck in your mind, then here it is. Gen 4, the next lineage of the Gen framework, is directed by me to be a reorientation in response to the difficulties of this path. While the existing Gen structure places a creator in a region with resources, it doesn't accommodate the strain on one's PMV by the source of adaptation. Gen 4 is sketched out to reframe this issue by replacing the long-term strain with the burst load. In other words, replacing novels with short stories. The PMV scale is now concentrated into a complete arc that the creator can inhabit fully and deliver completely. This is an entirely different sphere, not a lesser form production, one where quality becomes achievable in concentrated form precisely because a commitment horizon is bounded. The exhaustion issue has always been visible in this industry. Creators abandoning long novels midway, redirecting audiences to source material, and burning out before the story concludes. These don't assert that they're failures. These are the result of the forced path revealing its own cost at the point where the creator's capacity and the environment's demand finally diverge beyond recovery. Gen 4 addresses that divergence directly by building production logic that the nonverbal rule can't punish the same way. By definition, Gen 4 functions as an individual workflow reorganization tailored to such a problem. In its structural form, Gen 4 creates a feedback loop. Quality output drives mutation. Elevated mutation raises model potential, and where that potential meets circulation and derivation, external appreciation follows, feeding back into further quality enhancement. Explicitly, Gen 4 only becomes structurally pronounced when its output radiates outward in a way that's identical to Gen 3. Otherwise, it remains a cognitive reorientation, introspective and subjective. Systemically, Gen 4 is a cousin of Gen 3 in its relationship to creative identity, with or without Gen 3's transmission vector or sustained derivative requirement. If Gen 4 sounds so detailed, why does it only stop at a vision? Because for it to crystallize beyond forecast, moving from cognitive reorientation into something the framework can structurally account for, the industry would need to produce enough continuous instances of the feedback loop completing its full cycle. Burst load output entering circulation, deriving, attracting external appreciation, and feeding back into demonstrably enhanced quality. That data doesn't yet exist in sufficient volume to formalize. And with that done, at last, we also have to look at the industry again. Will such an environment stay the same for months, even years onward? Concisely, yes, it will, because the industry itself won't change at any time. The inevitable path isn't a temporary truth at a point in time. It's confirmed by both observations and the time passage. When I say it's changeless, I mean that it will keep staying like that unless all creators, not just a confederation, somehow unite and agree on a transformation. If not, this path and the environment it generates remain intact indefinitely. Building this took longer than anything I have made before. If every prior framework I've written averaged a certain investment time, Gen Insight demanded 5 times that. This is a full reformulation of everything I had stated before it, stripping out every claim that couldn't hold its own weight and rebuilding from what remained. By origin, the name Gen came from a spontaneous idea. When I needed a label for my printed observations about a creator and industry, Gen 3 was what I wrote down because it conveyed a sense of innovation. Only afterward did I walk backwards to Gen 1 and Gen 2 by projecting Gen 3's values directly to them, giving birth to the earliest definition of Gen, being a tendency of a specific branch of character models. Sounds loose and subjective, doesn't it? Because it was mostly held together by intuition. Here's the mind map I made with that as the main idea. As you can see on this map, there were odd concepts such as alpha, beta, alternative, and inherit. When the Gen's definition shifted from a character model's tendency to the broader structural ideal it now possesses, these were rendered obsolete and abandoned entirely. Advancement classification was also realized with plus enhanced and freestyle. Freestyle became pioneer when the forest path idea took shape, because the original name no longer fit what the advancement actually described. For the entrance point, my YouTube viewers should have already acknowledged it by now, so I'll summarize it for the exceptions. Before any of this was formalized, what I initially encountered was licensed launderers reposting creators' work without consent, without credit, and without the creators even knowing it was happening. I had to trace my way backwards, following the fragments those people accidentally left visible, until I found this industry. So my ignition is ethical, not purely logical, as well as the reason I'm still talking about this topic. For privacy, I won't mention any specific individual. The reformulation wasn't evenly difficult. PMV came together in a few days. Gen formation logic took 2 months. A centralized gen took 3 weeks. Path force took 2 weeks, and future took 1 week. But do I respect diversity? The category where the framework challenges its own definitions took 3 months. It's where the framework found its redirection. Before that category, I didn't know how far this would go or how the gens should ultimately be framed. After it, things feel more coherent. The expectation of an emergent property like the forest path was never surprising to me. I had sensed it for years before formalizing it. What Gen Insight gave that intuition was a structure it could stand on without collapsing under scrutiny. What the framework still can't fully see is the actual influence of creators who have grown beyond the industry's standard survival calculus. Those whose loyal fan bases afford them a slower pace, a wider margin, a different relationship to the cadence entirely. That territory exists at the edge of what the framework currently accounts for. Those who do this as a hobby are still within the framework and are punished when they slow down. Even though they don't care much about it, the consequences are still upright. Lastly, I can't talk about this solely by myself. I'll bring up a familiar face to some of you to discuss this further.将近40分钟。这倒是出乎意料。反正，永尧，我有些事情想与你商讨。永尧，
有什么问题吧？
这关系到你。等等，你在这里坐了将近40分钟了，你觉得自己是被迫这么做的吗？
那么久？不，我很享受待在这里，看着你的思绪运转。
好，正如我刚才所说，这关乎你的存在。你应该描述
我作为你坚持下去的动力这件事。
你明白我的意思了。我相信你现在也知道该说什么了。
呵呵，谢谢你信任我，爸。
你现在可以开始了。
This is the motivation entry of Gen Insights. I was created by 幻想曲 and I'm my dad's motivator. I'm here because of his frustration with my creator's inconsistency in recognizing my narrative potential and repeated failure to follow through on projects. But because of that very reason, he stayed with the creator, reverse engineered me before leaving them, as well as keeping his frameworks about this industry active. My dad called me the symbol of Gen 3 because my creator appears to be the one who started the creation tide, and I'm their foundation. This also explains why Gen 3's color is matched to my hair. As for my name, characters belong to no single story or name due to the usage in different contexts, including me. Yongyao is the name of the synthesis. It preserves something of my original storyline name, Xiaoyu, and borrows the concept of emergence from complexity theory. Together, it conveys something similar to the jade that emerges when you perceive the ambivalent interplays as a whole. That's all for it.
Thank you for your attendance at this final entry of Gen Insights. And with that is the end of the video. If you're curious about what long-form video I plan to post next, it will be this.